Close your eyes and imagine standing on a beach. Not just any beach. This is the southern coast of Africa, 100,000 years ago. The waves sound the same as they do today, that eternal rhythm of water meeting land. But everything else is different. Wrong, almost. Alien. The water in front of you sits lower than it should. Much lower. You can see exposed rock shelves that in your time would be deep underwater. The sea level has dropped more than 60 feet below where it sits today, and it's still falling, inch by inch, year by year, as massive glaciers in the far north lock away the planet's water in walls of ice miles thick. Behind you, the landscape stretches inland. Not the grasslands or forests you might expect. The climate is colder than modern Africa, drier. The air itself tastes different, carries different scents. This is Earth in transition, descending into the grip of another ice age. The planet's slow waltz through space, those subtle shifts in orbital tilt and wobble that humans won't understand for another 100,000 years, they're pushing the climate into refrigeration mode. But here's what you need to understand about 100,000 years ago. It's not the ice itself that matters, not yet. The glaciers are still forming, still growing in Canada and Scandinavia, spreading their frozen fingers across landscapes that will one day birth human civilization. The real story is what's happening everywhere else, the cascading effects of a planet cooling down. Africa, where your ancestors live, is experiencing what scientists will one day call increased aridity. That's a polite way of saying it's getting harder to survive. The great forests that had covered much of the continent are shrinking, retreating, breaking apart into isolated pockets. Rivers that used to flow year-round are becoming seasonal, then disappearing entirely. Lakes that had sustained life for millions of years are drying into salt pans and memories. The Sahara, that massive desert you know from your time, it's growing more extreme. There are brief wet periods, temporary windows when rain returns and grasslands bloom, but those windows are closing. Around 100,000 years ago, North Africa is becoming increasingly difficult for humans to traverse. Not impossible, not yet, but challenging enough that migration routes that once connected the continent to the Middle East and beyond are becoming bottlenecks, barriers, dead ends. This matters more than you might think, because at this exact moment in time, Earth is host to multiple human species, not just one, multiple. Think about that. Right now, as you stand on this imaginary beach, there are Neanderthals living in caves across Europe and Western Asia. Robust, cold-adapted, with their own sophisticated culture and technology. They're hunting mammoth and woolly rhinoceros. They're making fire, crafting tools, probably speaking some form of language. Further east, across the vast steppes of Asia, the Denisovans exist. We know less about them because their fossils are frustratingly rare. A finger bone here, a tooth there, a jawbone found high in the Tibetan plateau. But their DNA tells us they were real. They were widespread. They were adapting to environments from Siberia to Southeast Asia. They had their own innovations, their own cultures, their own story that we're only beginning to piece together. And possibly, maybe, Homo erectus still clings to existence in Java, the same species that left Africa nearly 2 million years ago, that spread across the old world, that learned to control fire and hunt cooperatively. The fossil record is murky around 100,000 years ago, but some evidence suggests they might have survived on those Indonesian islands until about this time, the last representatives of a lineage that had been successful for over 1.5 million years, finally reaching their evolutionary dead end. But we're not here to talk about them. We're here to talk about your ancestors, Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, people who, if you saw them on the street in your time, you wouldn't look twice. Their bodies were modern, fully modern, by at least 200,000 years ago and probably earlier. Their brains were the same size as yours. Their hands had the same dexterity, could make the same gestures, could hold tools with the same precision. And around 100,000 years ago, they're in trouble. This is what the genetic evidence tells us. Around this time, possibly slightly earlier, the Homo sapiens population crashed. Not extinction, but close. Population geneticists can read this in modern DNA like archaeologists read ancient settlements. The signatures of what they call a bottleneck, a dramatic reduction in population size that left its mark on every human alive today. How small did we get? Estimates vary, but some suggest the entire global Homo sapiens population might have numbered in the low thousands, maybe 10,000 individuals, maybe fewer. For comparison, there are more mountain gorillas alive today than there might have been humans 100,000 years ago. We were rare, fragmented, scattered across a hostile continent in small isolated groups just trying to survive. The climate was doing this to us. The same climate shifts that were building ice sheets in the north were making Africa less livable. Resources were scarcer. Territories that could support a group were smaller, harder to find, difficult to defend. And it wasn't just about food or water, though those were critical. It was about stability, or rather the lack of it. See, the climate around 100,000 years ago wasn't just cold and dry. It was volatile, unpredictable, prone to rapid shifts that could transform landscapes within a human lifetime. A region that had been relatively wet could dry out in a few decades. Rivers could change course. Food sources could collapse. The ancestors who survived this period had to be adaptable, flexible, creative in ways their predecessors hadn't needed to be. And somehow, against all odds, in one of the worst periods for human survival in the past 200,000 years, our ancestors were doing something remarkable. They were innovating. They were creating. They were developing technologies and cultural practices that, in retrospect, mark them as behaviourally modern in ways earlier humans were not. This is the paradox that fascinates archaeologists. This is the mystery that drives research. How did a population on the edge of extinction, living in small fragmented groups, barely hanging on in an unstable climate, manage to develop some of the most sophisticated cultural behaviours we see in the entire Middle Stone Age? The answer lies in caves, specifically in caves along the southern coast of Africa, places like Blombos Cave, Pinnacle Point, Clayses River. These limestone shelters, carved into coastal cliffs by ancient seas, became refuges, not just physical shelters from weather and predators, but cultural centres where knowledge accumulated, where innovations developed, where something fundamentally human was taking shape. At 100,000 years ago, the coast was different. Remember, sea level was dropping. The shoreline was further out, exposing extensive intertidal zones rich with shellfish, seaweed, seals, seabirds. These coastal areas offered resources that didn't disappear when drought struck inland. The ocean was reliable in ways that terrestrial environments were not. And the people living in these coastal caves were doing something previous humans hadn't consistently done. They were exploiting marine resources systematically, not opportunistically, not occasionally, but as a core part of their subsistence strategy. Shell middens, massive piles of discarded shells, start appearing in the archaeological record around this time. These aren't garbage dumps. They're evidence of sustained, deliberate harvesting of shellfish. Why does this matter? Because marine resources, shellfish in particular, are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, the same nutrients that are crucial for brain development and function. Some researchers think this coastal adaptation, this exploitation of marine resources, might have provided the nutritional foundation that supported the development of modern human cognition. But it's not just about what they ate. It's about what they made, what they created, what they left behind for us to find 100,000 years later. In these caves, in layers of sediment dated to right around 100,000 years ago, archaeologists are finding evidence of behaviours that challenge everything we thought we knew about when humans became truly human. Modern, behaviourally modern, cognitively modern. Whatever term you want to use for that ineffable quality that separates us from every other species that has ever lived. They were making paint, actual paint, not just using ochre as a raw material, but deliberately mixing it with other substances, grinding it into powder, combining it with charcoal, bone meal, perhaps seal fat or other binding agents, creating a paint that could be stored, transported, applied for purposes we can only guess at. Body painting maybe, decoration of objects or shelters, ritual use. We don't know. But the mere fact that they were doing this shows planning, chemical knowledge, abstract thinking. They were making jewellery, taking shells from the beach, shells of a specific species, a specific size range, a specific colour, deliberately piercing them, probably with bone awls, threading them onto strings made from plant fibres or sinew, creating necklaces or bracelets that served no practical survival purpose, but were clearly important enough that people invested time and effort into making them. They were engraving patterns, taking pieces of ochre and inscribing them with geometric designs, cross-hatched lines, parallel marks, patterns that repeat with such regularity that they can't be random scratches. These are intentional, deliberate creations, symbols, possibly the earliest examples of abstract representation by human hands. They were making sophisticated tools, not just simple stone flakes, but carefully crafted points using a technique called Levallois preparation. This involves shaping a core stone so precisely that when you strike it correctly, a finished tool pops off with minimal additional work. It requires planning, spatial reasoning, a mental template of the desired end product. It requires teaching, because nobody figures this out on their own. It requires language, because complex technical knowledge needs verbal instruction to transmit across generations. They were using bone for tools, sharpening bones into awls, needles, points, modifying them deliberately, sometimes even decorating them. Previous humans had occasionally used bone, but around 100,000 years ago, it becomes a regular part of the toolkit. This shows expanding material knowledge, experimentation, willingness to innovate. All of these behaviors that mark modern human cognition, they're appearing in the archaeological record right around 100,000 years ago. In the darkest moment of human history, when our population was at its lowest, when survival was most precarious, our ancestors in these African coastal caves were doing something unprecedented. They were becoming us, not biologically. That had happened earlier. Their bodies, their brains, their basic anatomy, that was already modern by 200,000 years ago or earlier. But around 100,000 years ago, something clicked into place cognitively. Some threshold was crossed. Some combination of brain structure, social organization, and accumulated cultural knowledge reached a tipping point. And here's the really frustrating thing. We're not entirely sure why. Why did behavioral modernity emerge when it did? Why, in this particular time and place? Why, paradoxically, during one of the worst periods for human survival? Was it the climate stress itself that drove innovation? Small populations forced to adapt or die, selecting for the most creative, flexible, innovative individuals? Was it the coastal environment, providing stable resources that allowed leisure time for experimentation and cultural development? Was it population structure, small isolated groups that allowed innovations to spread and stick rather than being swamped by larger, more conservative populations? We don't know. We have theories, educated guesses, but the honest answer is we don't fully understand the mechanism. What we do know is that it happened. The evidence is there in the caves, in the artifacts, in the layers of sediment that preserve moments from 100,000 years ago. And we know that the people doing this, your ancestors at 100,000 years ago, they weren't some transitional form, some halfway point between archaic humans and modernity. They were fully human in every sense that matters. If you could bring an infant from 100,000 years ago forward to your time, raise them in a modern family, they'd be indistinguishable from anyone else. They'd learn language, use technology, create art, form relationships, wonder about the stars. The capacity was there. The potential was there. Everything that makes humans human was there, sitting in those caves on the coast of Africa 100,000 years ago, at the moment when the species nearly blinked out of existence. They didn't know they were at a threshold, couldn't know that their descendants would one day spread across every continent, would develop agriculture and cities and writing, would build telescopes and computers, and eventually figure out how to extract ancient DNA from fossils to reconstruct the very moment we're exploring now. They were just trying to survive, trying to feed themselves and their children, trying to pass on knowledge and skills and whatever fragments of culture they'd accumulated, trying to make it through one more day, one more season, one more generation, in a world that was actively trying to kill them. And they succeeded. Obviously, they succeeded. You're here, after all, reading these words. Every human alive today descended from those few thousand survivors who made it through the bottleneck around 100,000 years ago. We are their legacy, their vindication, the proof that what they did, however they did it, was enough. But what exactly were they doing? What did daily life look like? What did they think about as they sat by fires in those caves, listening to waves crash against rocks while ice sheets grew in the far north? What stories did they tell? What dreams did they have? What did it feel like to be human when being human meant belonging to a species so rare you might live your entire life without meeting anyone outside your immediate group? That's what we're going to explore. The archaeological evidence can't tell us everything, can't tell us what they felt, what they believed, what private thoughts passed through minds identical to ours. but it can tell us what they made, what they ate, how they lived, how they died. It can give us glimpses, fragments, snapshots of life 100,000 years ago. So let's step into those caves. Let's examine the artifacts, piece together the clues, reconstruct what we can of a world that existed for just a moment in the vast span of human history. A moment when everything balanced on a knife's edge, when the species that would eventually dominate the planet was just a scattered population of survivors doing their best in a hostile world. Let's talk about what our ancestors were really doing 100,000 years ago. If you're enjoying this journey into our deep past, maybe hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. The comments always blow my mind. Someone in Brisbane at dawn, someone in Stockholm at midnight, all of us wondering about the same vanished world. Let's talk about the weather 100,000 years ago, except calling it weather almost feels trivial, like complaining about a rainy Tuesday, when what you're actually facing is a slow-motion apocalypse that will last for tens of thousands of years. 100,000 years ago, Earth was beginning its descent into the last ice age. Not the coldest part yet, that wouldn't come for another 80,000 years or so, but the transition was underway. And transitions, as it turns out, are often more dangerous than the extremes themselves, because during a transition nothing is stable, nothing is predictable, the rules keep changing. In the far north, in places where today you'd find Stockholm or Moscow or Montreal, glaciers were beginning to form, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but building, accumulating, growing year by year as snow fell and didn't quite melt, and more snow fell on top of it. These ice sheets would eventually cover millions of square miles, reaching thicknesses of 2 miles in some places. But 100,000 years ago they were just getting started. A promise, or a threat, of what was coming. But your ancestors weren't living under glaciers. They were living in Africa. Most of them anyway. A few adventurous populations had made it to the Middle East, but the overwhelming majority of humanity was still on the continent where our species had evolved. And in Africa, the climate changes weren't about ice. They were about something more fundamental to survival. Water. Africa 100,000 years ago was drying out. Not everywhere, not all at once, but the overall trend was toward increased aridity. The great climate cycles that govern monsoon patterns and rainfall distribution were shifting. Areas that had been relatively lush were becoming drier. Water sources that had been reliable were becoming seasonal or disappearing entirely. Forests were contracting. Grasslands were expanding. The landscape was transforming in ways that forced everything living on it to adapt or move or die. This wasn't a smooth, gradual process. That would almost be easier to deal with. No, the climate was unstable, oscillating. There'd be a period of relative moisture, enough to support larger populations and more diverse ecosystems. Then a switch would flip, sometimes over just a few centuries, and suddenly you're in a drought period that lasts for thousands of years, then back to moisture, then dry again. This kind of variability is brutal on any species trying to establish stable populations. The Sahara, which today is the world's largest hot desert, was oscillating between desert and something more habitable, though even during wet periods it wasn't exactly welcoming. But 100,000 years ago it was mostly in a dry phase, a massive barrier stretching across North Africa, cutting populations off from each other, limiting movement, creating isolated pockets where humans and other animals had to adapt to local conditions or perish. East Africa, the region where much of human evolution had played out, was experiencing its own climate drama. The Great Lakes that are such a defining feature of the landscape today were at lower levels. Some had dried up entirely during the driest periods. The forests that covered much of the region were fragmenting, being replaced by more open woodlands and grasslands. This created a patchwork environment, mosaics of different habitat types rather than the continuous forest that had existed earlier. South Africa, where some of our best archaeological evidence comes from, was cooler and drier than today. The coastline was farther out because sea levels were dropping as water got locked up in growing ice sheets in the far north. This exposed new land, continental shelf that's now underwater, creating coastal plains that offered different resources. Shellfish, seabirds, marine mammals. The people living there were learning to exploit these resources, adapting to a coastal lifestyle that would prove crucial later. But here's what makes the climate story of 100,000 years ago so important for understanding human evolution. This environmental instability, this constant shifting and changing, It created precisely the conditions that favor innovative, flexible species. Species that can't adapt quickly go extinct. Species that can adapt, thrive. Humans, it turns out, were exceptionally good at adaptation. Not biological adaptation, that takes too long. Cultural adaptation, behavioral flexibility, the ability to learn new strategies, develop new technologies, organize in new ways depending on what the environment threw at them. The climate wasn't just a backdrop to human evolution. It was an active driver, a selective pressure that weeded out the inflexible and rewarded the clever. Think about what it means to live in an environment where water sources are unreliable. You can't just stay in one place hoping it will rain. You need to know your territory intimately. Every waterhole, every seasonal stream, every spring. You need to read the landscape, understand the patterns, predict where water might be found during different seasons. This requires detailed ecological knowledge accumulated over generations and passed down through teaching. Or think about what it means when the types of plants and animals available are constantly changing. The forest edge moving in and out over decades and centuries. One generation might grow up hunting forest animals and gathering forest plants. Their children might need to adapt to more open environments with different prey species and different plants. This requires flexible thinking, the ability to learn new skills, willingness to try new strategies. The climate wasn't just making life hard, it was actively selecting for intelligence, for social learning, for cooperation. Because individuals alone couldn't accumulate enough knowledge to survive such variable conditions, but groups could. Groups that shared information, that taught their young, that cooperated in solving problems, those groups survived. The ones that didn't. And there's another dimension to this climate story that matters. The oscillations weren't random. They followed patterns driven by Earth's orbital cycles. The wobble of Earth's axis, the shape of its orbit around the Sun. These astronomical factors create cyclical changes in how much sunlight different parts of the planet receive at different times of year. These cycles operate on timescales of thousands to tens of thousands of years. One of the most important of these cycles affects the African monsoon. During certain phases of the cycle, summer insolation is higher, creating stronger temperature contrasts between land and ocean, pulling more moisture-laden air onto the continent. These are the wet phases, the green Sahara periods when the desert blooms and grasslands spread and water is more abundant. During other phases, the monsoon weakens, rainfall decreases and aridity increases. 100,000 years ago happened to fall during a transition from a relatively wet phase to a drier phase. The last interglacial period, when global temperatures had been warmer and African climates more favourable, was ending. The descent into colder, drier conditions was underway. This timing is crucial because it means the humans living then were experiencing deteriorating conditions. They were having to cope with increasing environmental stress. This stress had consequences. Population sizes probably shrank during the driest periods. Groups that had been large enough to maintain genetic diversity might have been reduced to small bands barely hanging on. Some populations probably went extinct entirely, their lineages ending without descendants. The ones that survived were the lucky ones, or the clever ones, or probably both. But there's evidence that humans weren't just passively experiencing these climate changes. They were responding actively, adapting their technologies and behaviours. The archaeological record shows innovations appearing around this time. New types of stone tools, use of fire becoming more systematic, exploitation of coastal resources intensifying. These aren't coincidental. These are adaptive responses to environmental challenges. Take coastal adaptation. As sea levels dropped and continental shelves were exposed, new coastlines appeared with rich marine resources. Humans who figured out how to harvest shellfish, catch fish, hunt seals, they gained access to reliable protein sources that didn't depend on rainfall or vegetation. This buffered them against inland droughts, gave them options when other food sources failed. Or take fire. Controlling fire becomes even more valuable during cooler, more variable climates. It provides warmth, obviously, but also the ability to cook food, making more types of plants digestible and making meat safer to eat. Fire can be used to modify landscapes, create clearings, drive game during hunts. It's a technology multiplier, and its importance increases during environmental stress. The stone tool technologies emerging around this time also reflect adaptation to changing conditions. The shift from large hand axes to smaller, more varied tools meant humans could create specialized implements for specific tasks. A blade for cutting hide, a point for a spear, a scraper for working wood. This technological diversity suggests people were exploiting a wider range of resources, adapting to different environments, being flexible in their subsistence strategies. Climate also affected population movement and contact. During wetter periods, the Sahara became more permeable. Humans could move across it, following water sources and game. This created opportunities for populations to mix, exchange genes and ideas and technologies. During dry periods, the Sahara became a barrier, isolating populations, forcing them to develop independently. The same pattern played out in other regions. Corridors opened and closed between Africa and the Middle East depending on climate conditions. During favourable periods, humans could move into the Levant, establishing populations outside Africa. During unfavourable periods, these populations might die out or retreat back. The archaeological record shows possible early exits from Africa around 100,000 years ago, small groups making it to what's now Israel. But these early attempts apparently didn't lead to permanent colonization. The climate window closed, or the populations weren't large enough to sustain themselves, or they simply got unlucky. This pattern of expansion and contraction, of populations spreading during good times and contracting during bad, creates what geneticists call a metapopulation structure. Instead of one large stable population, you have multiple smaller populations that are sometimes connected and sometimes isolated. Genes and ideas can flow between them during connection periods, but they can also diverge during isolation periods. This structure may have been crucial for human evolution, creating conditions where innovations could arise in isolated groups and then spread when conditions improved. The climate 100,000 years ago was also creating regional differences. Populations living in different parts of Africa were experiencing different local conditions. East Africa, with its high-altitude plateaus, had different climate patterns than the lowland forests of Central Africa or the Mediterranean climate of South Africa. These regional differences meant humans were adapting to diverse environments even within Africa. This diversity of experience, diversity of adaptation, was creating the foundation for the eventual success of our species. Because here's the crucial insight: the climate instability that made life harder in the short term was making humans more capable in the long term. Every challenge overcome was a lesson learned, a skill developed, a technology invented. The groups that survived the droughts and the floods and the temperature swings were the ones with the deepest knowledge, the most sophisticated tools, the strongest social bonds. They were, in a very real sense, being forged by the climate into something more capable. And this matters for understanding what comes later. When humans eventually do successfully migrate out of Africa and spread across the planet, colonizing environments from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, they're able to do this because of capabilities developed during this period. The behavioral flexibility, the technological innovation, the social cooperation, all of it honed by generations of dealing with African climate instability. The weather 100,000 years ago wasn't just weather, it was a crucible, a forge, an evolutionary pressure cooker. It was creating the conditions that would allow a small, vulnerable species of African ape to eventually dominate every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth. But that domination was still tens of thousands of years in the future. Right now, 100,000 years ago, your ancestors were just trying to survive the next dry season, find the next waterhole, make it through to tomorrow. The climate was harsh, but it was making humans strong, testing them, challenging them, killing the ones who couldn't adapt and letting the clever ones live to pass on their genes and their knowledge. This was selection in action. This was evolution happening in real time. And the descendants of those survivors, the ones who made it through this crucible, they would go on to inherit the Earth. But first, they had to develop the tools to survive. And that's where the story gets really interesting. Pick up a rock, any rock. Feel its weight in your hand. Now imagine that this rock, or one like it, is the difference between eating and starving, between killing an animal and being killed by one, between making it through winter and freezing to death. That's what stone meant to your ancestors 100,000 years ago. It wasn't just a material, it was survival itself, but not just any stone would do. 100,000 years ago, humans had become incredibly sophisticated in their understanding of stone. They knew which rocks would flake properly when struck, which ones would hold an edge, which ones were worth carrying for miles because they were better than anything available locally. This wasn't instinct. This was learned knowledge, passed down through generations, refined through countless hours of practice and teaching. The period archaeologists call the Middle Stone Age, roughly 300,000 to 30,000 years ago, represents a revolution in how humans made and used tools. If you could somehow visit a tool-making site from 100,000 years ago and compare it to one from 1,000,000 years earlier, you'd see the difference immediately. The older site would be dominated by large, heavy hand axes, multi-purpose tools that could be used for many tasks but weren't optimized for any particular one. The newer site would look completely different. Smaller tools, more variety, specialized implements designed for specific purposes. This shift matters. It represents a change in how humans thought about technology. The old approach was to make one tool that could do everything adequately. The new approach was to make multiple tools, each one perfect for its specific task. This requires more planning, more knowledge, more skill. It also requires more intelligence, because you need to imagine the task you'll need to perform in the future and create the right tool for it ahead of time. Take projectile points. These are stone tips designed to be attached to spears. Archaeological sites from Ethiopia dated to around 100,000 years ago have yielded stone points that show clear signs of hafting, of being attached to wooden shafts. This isn't just picking up a sharp rock and throwing it. This is composite technology. You need to shape the stone point correctly, find or make a straight shaft from wood, create some kind of binding material, probably sinew or plant fibre. Attach the point securely so it won't come loose when you throw the spear. Maybe use adhesive, resin from trees heated and applied to strengthen the bond. Each step requires knowledge and skill. More importantly, each step requires you to imagine the final product before you start. You need to hold in your mind the image of a completed spear and work backwards from that, planning each stage of manufacture. This is sophisticated, abstract thinking, and it's happening 100,000 years ago. The stone tools themselves show this sophistication. Archaeologists categorize Middle Stone Age tools by their production techniques. One method, called Levallois technique, involves carefully preparing a core of stone by removing flakes in a specific pattern. Once the core is prepared, a single strike can detach a flake with a predetermined shape. It's like pre-cutting a diamond. You do all the work up front in preparing the stone, then with one blow you get exactly the flake you want. This technique requires incredible three-dimensional visualization. You need to look at a rough piece of stone and see inside it the flakes you're going to produce. You need to understand how stone fractures, how force propagates through different types of rock, how angle and impact point affect the result. This knowledge isn't innate. It's learned through years of practice and instruction from skilled toolmakers. At some sites from around this period, archaeologists find evidence of heat treatment. Stones were deliberately heated in fires to change their flaking properties. Heat alters the internal structure of certain rocks, making them easier to work and allowing for thinner, sharper tools. This is materials science. This is understanding that you can transform materials through controlled application of heat. It's a conceptual leap that shows sophisticated technical knowledge. The tools themselves tell stories. A stone point found at a site in Kenya shows impact fractures consistent with striking bone at high velocity. This point was used to hunt, probably attached to a thrown spear or dart. It hit its target hard enough to penetrate and then break. The hunters retrieved it, possibly from the body of their kill, brought it back to camp where it was eventually lost or discarded. Scrapers, tools with curved working edges, show different wear patterns. Microscopic analysis reveals traces of hide, wood, plant materials. These tools were used for processing materials, scraping meat from hides, working leather, shaping wood, preparing plant fibers. Each activity leaves distinct traces on the tool's edge, visible under magnification. By examining these traces, archaeologists can reconstruct how tools were used even after 100,000 years. The distribution of different tool types at a site reveals something about how space was organized. At some South African sites, you find areas with lots of manufacturing debris, the waste flakes from tool production, but few finished tools. These were workshops, places where tools were made. Other areas have finished tools and animal bones, but little manufacturing debris. These were living spaces, places where tools were used for butchering and other daily activities. This spatial organization suggests planning, forethought, understanding that different activities should happen in different places. Obsidian, volcanic glass that flakes beautifully and creates incredibly sharp edges, appears at sites far from any volcanic source. This means trade networks, or at least long-distance movement. Someone travelled hundreds of miles to obtain this valuable material, or they received it through exchange with other groups. Either way, it indicates that groups weren't isolated. There was contact, communication, movement of goods across considerable distances. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found something remarkable in layers dated to around 100,000 years ago. 2 abalone shells, each containing traces of ochre mixed with other materials, bone tools showing evidence of use in grinding and mixing, seal bone with residue suggesting it was used to add fat to the mixture. This was a toolkit for making liquid pigment, a paint processing workshop. Think about what this means. Someone collected ochre, a naturally occurring iron oxide that produces red and yellow colours. They gathered specific shells to use as containers. They made tools specifically for grinding and mixing. They understood that adding fat would make the pigment more liquid, easier to apply. They created this mixture and stored it for later use. This isn't just making tools. This is making tools to make something else. This is technology stacking, one innovation building on another. What were they using this pigment for? We don't know for certain. Body painting seems likely. Many modern hunter-gatherer societies use ochre for decoration, for ritual purposes, for sun protection. Rock art is another possibility, though no rock art from this early survives in most regions. The point is that people 100,000 years ago were doing something that had no immediate survival benefit. They weren't making weapons or cutting tools, they were making art supplies. Shell beads from the same period tell a similar story. Nassarius shells, small marine snails, found at multiple sites across Africa and the Middle East. These shells have been deliberately perforated, a hole carefully made near the opening, where patterns show they were strung together and worn, probably as necklaces or bracelets. Some shells show traces of ochre, suggesting they were coloured or that they were worn by someone whose body was painted. Personal ornaments represent a conceptual leap. They have no functional purpose in terms of survival. You can't eat them, you can't hunt with them. They don't keep you warm or provide shelter. Their value is entirely symbolic. They communicate something about the wearer: status, group membership, personal identity, aesthetic preference. Creating and wearing beads means you're thinking in terms of symbols and social signals. You're operating in a world where appearance matters, where what you wear communicates who you are. The consistency of bead manufacture at sites separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years suggests this wasn't random. It was a tradition. Groups were learning from each other, maintaining cultural practices across generations. When you find similar beads at a site in Morocco and a site in South Africa, sites separated by the length of a continent, you're seeing evidence of shared culture, of ideas moving through populations. But here's what's fascinating and frustrating about the archaeological record from 100,000 years ago. These innovations don't appear everywhere at once. They show up at some sites, then disappear. Later, they reappear at other sites. It's not a steady progression from simple to complex. It's more like a flickering, innovations appearing, disappearing, appearing again. Some researchers interpret this as evidence that modern human behaviour was evolving gradually, appearing in some populations but not others, sometimes being lost when populations went extinct or cultures changed. Others think the pattern reflects preservation bias. Maybe the behaviours were continuous but we're only finding the sites where they happen to be preserved. Maybe most of the evidence is gone, destroyed by time and geology. The technology of 100,000 years ago shows humans solving problems creatively. When large game was scarce, they developed sophisticated fishing equipment. Bone tools from sites in the Democratic Republic of Congo dated to around 90,000 years ago show barbed points designed for spearing fish. These aren't simple stakes sharpened at one end. These are carefully crafted implements with multiple barbs carved along the shaft, designed to prevent fish from sliding off once impaled. Coastal sites show evidence of systematic shellfish harvesting. Not just opportunistic collection, but deliberate exploitation of marine resources. People were travelling to specific locations at specific times, taking advantage of tides and seasons to harvest shellfish in large quantities. This requires planning, requires knowledge of lunar cycles and tides, requires understanding of marine ecology. And it all required teaching. You can't figure out advanced stone tool manufacturing by trial and error. You can't independently invent Levallois technique or discover which stones respond to heat treatment. These are complex skills that must be learned from someone who already knows them. This means instruction, demonstration, practice, feedback. It means social learning operating at a high level. Children 100,000 years ago would have spent years learning toolmaking, watching adults work, practicing on less valuable materials, making mistakes and learning from them, gradually developing the muscle memory, the eye for stone quality, the understanding of fracture mechanics. By the time they were adults, they possessed knowledge accumulated over countless generations, refined through millennia of innovation and experimentation. This transmission of knowledge across generations is culture. It's what allows humans to accumulate innovations instead of having to rediscover them every generation. And 100,000 years ago, this cultural transmission was becoming sophisticated enough to produce and maintain complex technologies across large populations. The tools themselves are just the physical evidence. What they represent is even more significant. Abstract thinking, planning, teaching, innovation, symbolic behavior, all the cognitive capabilities that make humans unique. 100,000 years ago, all of this was present, at least in nascent form. The hardware had been in place for a while. Now the software was being developed, refined, passed down through generations. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago were toolmakers of remarkable sophistication. They understood materials science, mechanical engineering, composite construction. They could visualize objects before making them, plan complex sequences of actions, teach complicated skills to others. They were innovators, experimenters, problem solvers. And they were doing all of this with brains anatomically identical to yours, with hands and bodies capable of the same dexterity and strength you possess. The distance between us and them isn't about intelligence or capability. It's about accumulated knowledge, about having 100,000 more years of innovation and discovery to build on. But the fundamental abilities, the cognitive toolkit that allows humans to make tools and use them to transform their environment, that was already present. Already operating at a high level, already producing technologies that would have seemed impossibly sophisticated just a few 100,000 years earlier. Stone tools, shell beads, ochre processing kits. These artifacts scattered across African sites from 100,000 years ago are more than just objects. They're evidence of minds working at full capacity, of humans beginning to operate in the symbolic and technological realm that would eventually lead to everything we know. They're proof that the revolution was underway, even if we can only glimpse it through the fragments that survived. There's a piece of ochre sitting in a museum in South Africa that will make you rethink what it means to be human. It's roughly 2 inches long, brick red, and covered in a geometric pattern. Cross-hatched lines, deliberately carved, forming an abstract design. It doesn't look like much. But this piece of ochre is 100,000 years old, and it represents something profound. The moment when humans started thinking symbolically, when we began creating meaning that existed beyond the immediate physical world. Symbolic thinking is what separates humans from every other species on Earth. It's the ability to let one thing represent another thing, to create abstract concepts, to imagine things that don't exist and then bring them into existence. Language is symbolic thinking. Art is symbolic thinking. Mathematics, music, religion, all of it requires the ability to operate in a symbolic realm, where meanings are shared and understood within a culture. And 100,000 years ago, this ability was emerging. We can see it in the archaeological record, not as clearly as we'd like, but it's there. Engraved patterns, personal ornaments, pigment processing. Each of these represents a step into the symbolic world, evidence that human minds were beginning to operate in ways that would eventually produce everything from cave paintings to computer code. The ochre from Blombos Cave is the most famous example, but it's not alone. Multiple pieces of ochre from layers dated between 75,000 and 100,000 years ago show deliberate engravings. Not random scratches from use. Deliberately created geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines, parallel marks, grids. Some pieces show multiple episodes of engraving, patterns added at different times, suggesting these objects were kept and reused. What do these patterns mean? We don't know. We'll never know. The people who made them have been dead for 100 millennia, and they left no key to decode their symbols. But the fact that the patterns exist, that's what matters. Someone sat down with a piece of ochre and a sharp stone point and spent time creating a design, not for any practical purpose, not to make the ochre better at any functional task, simply to create pattern, to impose order, to make marks that communicated something. This is art. Maybe not art as we usually think of it, not representational images of animals or people, but art in the sense of deliberate creation of visual pattern for non-utilitarian purposes, and it's appearing 100,000 years ago, at least at some sites, among some populations. The same layers that produced engraved ochre also yielded those perforated shell beads we talked about earlier. These two types of evidence reinforce each other. Multiple lines of evidence all pointing to the same conclusion. Humans 100,000 years ago were engaging in symbolic behavior. They were creating objects whose value was not in their practical function, but in their meaning, in what they represented, in what they communicated to others. Think about what it takes to create personal ornaments. First, you need the concept, the idea that wearing certain objects can communicate something about yourself to others. This requires understanding that appearance matters, that people pay attention to what you're wearing or how you look, that you can manipulate their perception of you through decoration. Then you need to actually make the ornaments. For shell beads, this means collecting specific shells. Not just any shells, but ones of the right size and shape. Often shells from particular species, suggesting selection based on aesthetic criteria. Then you need to perforate them without breaking them. Shells are fragile. Making a hole through one requires careful work, probably using a bone point or stone awl, applying pressure gradually, rotating the tool. It takes time and skill. Then you need to string them. This requires cordage, string made from plant fibers or animal sinew. Making cordage is itself a complex task requiring knowledge of which plants produce good fiber, how to process them, how to twist them into strong string. Then you string the beads, creating a necklace or bracelet or other ornament. Finally, you wear it. You maintain it. When beads break or get lost, you replace them. The ornament becomes part of your identity, part of how others recognize and think about you. Some of the shells from Blombos show wear patterns consistent with being worn for extended periods. These weren't made once and discarded. They were valued, maintained, worn regularly. And here's what's really significant. Similar beads appear at multiple sites across Africa and into the Middle East. Not identical, but similar enough to suggest a shared cultural tradition. At Skull Cave in Israel, shells from 100,000-year-old levels show the same kind of perforation and wear patterns as shells from South African sites. These sites are separated by thousands of miles, yet people at both locations were making and wearing similar ornaments. This suggests a shared concept had spread across enormous distances, maybe through population movement, people migrating and bringing their traditions with them. Maybe through cultural diffusion, ideas spreading from group to group through contact and trade. Either way, it indicates that symbolic behavior wasn't isolated to one location. It was spreading, becoming part of human culture across a wide geographic range. The ochre processing workshop from Blombos adds another dimension to this story. Remember those abalone shells containing pigment residue, the bone tools for grinding and mixing, the evidence of fat being added to create a liquid paint. This isn't just using ochre in its natural form, this is processing it, transforming it, creating a product with properties different from the raw material. Why go to this effort? Simple applications of ochre don't require liquid pigment. If you want to mark your skin with ochre, you can just rub the raw material directly on. But if you want to create more elaborate designs, to apply pigment to surfaces that aren't easy to rub directly, to mix colors or create different shades, then liquid pigment becomes valuable. This suggests people weren't just marking themselves randomly, they were creating intentional designs, possibly complex ones that required controlled application. What were they painting? Their own bodies is the most likely answer. Body painting is nearly universal among modern hunter-gatherer societies and has deep cultural significance. It can indicate status, mark important life events, identify group membership, serve ritual purposes. In some societies, body painting is an art form as elaborate as any Western painting tradition, with patterns passed down through generations carrying deep cultural meaning. We can't know what the body painting of 100,000 years ago looked like or what it meant, but we can infer that it mattered enough for people to invest significant time and effort in creating the materials. They weren't just smearing ochre around casually, they were processing pigments carefully, mixing them with other materials, storing them in containers, treating the whole process as something worth doing properly. Rock art is another possibility, though direct evidence is lacking from this period. The oldest clearly dated rock art is much more recent, only around 40,000 years old. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Rock art may have existed 100,000 years ago and simply not survived. Paint exposed to weather degrades, rock surfaces erode. What might have been vibrant images become invisible within a few thousand years unless conditions are perfect for preservation. Some researchers think the engraved patterns on ochre pieces might represent early attempts at notation, at recording information. The patterns are sometimes complex and regular enough to suggest they might encode meaning beyond pure decoration. Parallel lines in groups, cross-hatched grids, patterns that repeat across multiple pieces. Could these be counting systems, calendars, maps, messages? It's speculation, but not wild speculation. If humans 100,000 years ago were capable of creating symbolic representations, they might also have been trying to record information symbolically. Language is the elephant in the room when we talk about symbolic behavior. Fully modern language is symbolic thinking at its most sophisticated. Every word is a symbol, an arbitrary sound pattern that represents something else. Grammar is a symbolic system for organizing those symbols into meaningful structures. Language allows humans to share complex information, coordinate activities, transmit culture, think about abstract concepts. We can't know when fully modern language evolved because language doesn't fossilize. We can't dig up ancient conversations. But we can make inferences based on behavior. The complexity of technologies we see 100,000 years ago, the composite tools, the heat treatment of stone, the pigment processing, all of this would be difficult to learn and teach without language. Simple gestures and demonstrations might suffice for basic skills. But transmitting detailed procedural knowledge across generations really benefits from language. The symbolic artifacts provide another clue. If people were creating and using symbols in material form, engraved patterns and shell beads, they were likely also using symbols in linguistic form. The cognitive ability to think symbolically manifests in multiple domains. You don't develop sophisticated symbolic thinking for ornaments, but somehow fail to apply it to communication. So most researchers think that by 100,000 years ago, language was either fully modern or very close to it. Not the simple proto-language that may have existed earlier, limited vocabulary and primitive grammar, but something approaching the complexity and sophistication of modern languages. The ability to discuss abstract concepts, describe events in the past or future, explain complex procedures, tell stories, argue, joke, lie, all the things language allows us to do. If this is right, if language was reaching modern levels of complexity 100,000 years ago, it has profound implications. Language transforms human culture. It allows knowledge to accumulate much faster than it could through observation and imitation alone. It enables cooperation at scales impossible without linguistic communication. It makes humans into a species that lives as much in a world of shared meanings and symbols as in the physical world. The symbolic artifacts from this period, sparse as they are, hint at rich cultural lives that leave few archaeological traces. If people were engraving patterns and wearing ornaments and mixing paints, what else were they doing that didn't preserve? Were they singing? Making music on instruments that long ago rotted away? Telling stories around evening fires? Stories that were never written down but that shaped how people understood their world? Modern hunter-gatherer societies have incredibly rich oral traditions. Stories that encode ecological knowledge, historical information, moral lessons, cosmological beliefs. These stories are sophisticated, often containing complex nested narratives, symbolic meanings, wordplay that only works in the original language. There's no reason to think humans 100,000 years ago were any different. They probably had their own stories, their own songs, their own ways of making sense of existence. But none of that preserves. We're left with the material traces, the engraved ochre, the shell beads, the pigment processing kits, each one a tiny window into a symbolic world that was vast but largely invisible to archaeology. It's like trying to understand modern culture by examining only a few physical objects while remaining completely ignorant of literature, music, conversation, film, all the immaterial forms of culture that actually dominate human life. This is the frustration of studying 100,000 years ago. The material evidence proves that symbolic thinking was present and operating at a sophisticated level. But it can't show us what that symbolic thinking actually produced in terms of meanings, beliefs, stories, ideas. We know these people were creating culture, but we can't access most of what that culture contained. What we can say is this: 100,000 years ago, humans had crossed a threshold. They weren't just surviving. They weren't just making tools and hunting animals and gathering plants. They were creating meaning. They were operating in a symbolic realm where things could represent other things, where patterns could carry significance, where ornaments could communicate identity. They were becoming fully modern humans, not just anatomically, but behaviorally. The revolution wasn't complete yet. The full flowering of human symbolic culture, the elaborate art and ritual and mythology that would eventually emerge, that was still thousands of years in the future. But the foundation was being laid. The cognitive capabilities were in place. The first tentative steps into the symbolic realm had been taken. And those steps, preserved in engraved ochre and perforated shells in African archaeological sites, represent one of the most important transitions in the history of our species. The moment when we became creatures who live in meanings as much as in matter, when the inner world of thoughts and symbols became as important as the outer world of food and shelter and survival. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago were artists, storytellers, makers of meaning. They saw the world through eyes anatomically identical to yours, but also through minds that were learning to see symbolically, to impose order and pattern, to create beauty and significance. They were human in the fullest sense, and they were just beginning to discover what that meant. Now let's talk about what actually filled the days, because for all the fascinating evidence of symbolic behavior and technological innovation, most of life 100,000 years ago was about something much more basic. Finding enough to eat, not starving, making it to tomorrow. Your ancestors were hunter-gatherers. This term gets thrown around a lot, often without much thought about what it actually means. It means your entire food supply comes from wild sources. You don't plant anything, you don't tend crops, you don't store grain for winter or raise animals for slaughter. Every single calorie you consume, you either find growing wild or kill something to obtain. Every single day you need to find food or you die. It's that simple and that brutal. But here's what most people don't understand about hunter-gatherer life. It wasn't necessarily harder or more precarious than agricultural life. In many ways, it was more secure. Hunter-gatherers who knew their territory well, who understood the seasonal patterns of plants and animals, who had the skills to exploit diverse resources, they could live quite well. Better, in some ways, than early farmers who bet everything on a few crops and faced starvation when those crops failed. The key was knowledge. Ecological knowledge so detailed and comprehensive that it boggles the modern mind. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago knew their landscape intimately. Every plant species, whether it was edible, when it fruited, where it grew. Every animal species, its behavior patterns, its migrations, its weaknesses. Every water source, every shelter site, every danger. This knowledge was accumulated over generations and passed down through teaching and storytelling. Let's start with gathering. Because despite the name hunter-gatherer suggesting equal importance, gathering was probably more important in most environments. Plant foods, especially in Africa where most humans still lived, provided the bulk of calories for most groups. Reliable, predictable, if you knew where to look and when, easier to obtain than meat in many cases. But gathering isn't just wandering around picking berries. It's a skilled activity requiring deep knowledge. You need to know which plants are edible. Sounds simple, but there are thousands of plant species in most African ecosystems. Some are nutritious, some are poisonous, some are edible only if prepared correctly, toxic if eaten raw. Getting this wrong kills you. So plant knowledge had to be precise and had to be taught carefully to each generation. You also need to know when plants are available. Most plants have seasons. Fruits ripen at specific times. Seeds mature. Tubers are most nutritious at certain points in their growth cycle. A skilled gatherer knows the annual cycle of every useful plant in their territory. They can plan movements to be in the right place at the right time to harvest each resource as it becomes available. And you need to know where plants grow. Some species are common, others rare. Some grow only in specific habitats, along rivers or on hillsides or in particular soil types. Some appear only after fires or in disturbed areas. Knowing where to look saves enormous time and effort. The difference between a productive day of gathering and coming back empty-handed often comes down to this detailed spatial knowledge. Women probably did most of the gathering in groups 100,000 years ago, based on patterns seen in modern hunter-gatherer societies. Not because of any innate gender differences in ability, but because gathering was compatible with childcare in ways hunting wasn't. You could bring young children along on a gathering expedition. You couldn't bring them on a hunt where silence and speed were essential. But this division of labour wasn't absolute. Men gathered too, especially when hunting was unsuccessful, or when particularly valuable plant resources were available. Women probably participated in some types of hunting, especially communal hunts or fishing. The important thing is that everyone needed to know both sets of skills to some degree. Specialization existed but wasn't rigid. Gathering trips might last all day. A group of women and children leaving camp in the morning, spreading out across known productive areas, filling bags or baskets with edible plants, digging tubers with sharpened sticks, collecting seeds and fruits and nuts, talking as they worked, sharing information about what they were finding, teaching children to recognize useful plants, telling stories. Returning in late afternoon with enough plant food to feed the group for a day or two. Hunting was different, more variable, more risky, more exciting. Some days you came back with meat enough to feed everyone. Other days you came back with nothing. Success required skill, knowledge, patience, cooperation, and a fair amount of luck. The prey animals available 100,000 years ago in Africa were diverse. Large herbivores, antelopes of many species, zebra, buffalo, smaller animals, bush pigs, hyrax, various rodents, birds when they could be caught. The choice of prey depended on what was available, what the hunters were skilled at taking, what tools they had. Hunting strategies varied by prey type. Large animals like buffalo couldn't be brought down by a single hunter with a spear. Too dangerous, too much mass, too likely to kill you before you kill it. So, large game required cooperation. Groups of hunters working together surrounding an animal, throwing multiple spears, following it as it fled until blood loss weakened it enough to finish the kill safely. Smaller animals might be hunted individually or in pairs, tracking, stalking, waiting for the right moment to throw a spear or dart. Reading signs, understanding animal behaviour, predicting where prey would go. This required patience and observation skills developed over years of experience. Some hunting didn't involve direct confrontation at all. Traps and snares could capture animals without the hunter being present. A skilled trap maker could set dozens of snares across animal trails, checking them daily, reliably obtaining small game without the time and risk of active hunting. This was technology multiplying human effectiveness, allowing one person to hunt in multiple locations simultaneously. Coastal populations, like those at Blombos Cave, added another dimension to their subsistence strategies. The ocean and rocky shorelines provided resources unavailable inland. Shellfish, abundant and reliable, could be harvested at low tide without tools or special skills, just knowledge of tides and locations of productive beds. Fish could be speared in tidal pools or caught with bone hooks and line. Seabirds nested on coastal cliffs, providing eggs during breeding season. Seals hauled out on beaches could be hunted with clubs or spears. Even beached whales, though rare, provided enormous quantities of meat and blubber. Coastal living offered a diversity of resources that buffered against inland droughts and game scarcity. The daily rhythm of life probably went something like this. Wake at dawn, check the fire, add wood if needed, maybe eat a bit of leftover food from the previous day. Then decisions. What's the priority today? Are we low on plant foods? Send out a gathering party. Has it been a while since fresh meat? Organise a hunt. Are tools worn out or lost? Spend the day at camp making new ones. The group probably split up during the day, some heading out to gather, some hunting, some staying at camp to process foods, work on tools, watch young children. In late afternoon, people returned. The successful ones shared what they'd obtained. Meat was distributed, probably not equally, but according to social rules about who gets what. Plant foods were prepared for eating. Evening was social time. Fire providing light and warmth. People sitting together, eating, talking, working on small tasks. Repairing tools, making cordage, processing plant materials. Children playing. Stories being told. Knowledge being shared. Plans being made for tomorrow. Eventually sleep, probably in temporary shelters near the fire. Everyone grouped together for safety and warmth. But this daily routine varied enormously depending on location and season. Wet season versus dry season could completely change what resources were available. Some times of year, Food was abundant and life was relatively easy. Other times, especially during droughts, finding enough to eat required travelling long distances and exploiting marginal resources. Mobility was key. Hunter-gatherers 100,000 years ago were probably semi-nomadic, moving periodically to follow resources. Not random wandering, but planned movements between known locations. A territory used repeatedly, with detailed knowledge of every water source, every productive plant patch, every good hunting ground. Group sizes were probably small, 20 to 50. People in most cases, though groups might aggregate temporarily when resources were abundant or split up when resources were scarce. These were extended family groups, everyone related by blood or marriage, everyone knowing everyone else intimately. This small group size was necessary because you couldn't support large populations on wild resources without depleting them. Relationships within the group were crucial for survival. Cooperation in hunting and gathering, sharing of food, especially meat which couldn't be stored and would spoil if not consumed quickly. Childcare, with children being watched by multiple adults, not just parents. Knowledge sharing, the old teaching the young, the experienced helping the inexperienced. Conflict resolution, because disagreements were inevitable and groups were too small to afford serious splits. Leadership probably existed but was informal, based on skill, knowledge, personality rather than formal authority. The best hunter might lead hunting parties, the most knowledgeable plant gatherer might direct foraging expeditions, elders with decades of experience might advise on movements and strategies. But decisions were probably consensus-based, with input from many group members. Violence was a constant possibility, both from predators and from other human groups. Lions, leopards, hyenas all saw humans as potential prey, especially children or individuals caught alone. Encounters with other groups could be friendly, leading to trade and information exchange and occasionally intermarriage, or they could be hostile, leading to conflict over territories and resources. Death was familiar. Infant mortality was probably high, many children not surviving to adulthood. Injuries from hunting accidents, from predator attacks, from simple falls and mishaps. Infections that modern antibiotics would cure easily, but which could be fatal without treatment. Starvation during severe droughts, or when key resources failed. The average life expectancy was probably 30 to 40 years, though people who survived childhood and early adulthood might live much longer. But this doesn't mean life was miserable. Modern studies of hunter-gatherer societies show people generally report high life satisfaction. They have strong social bonds, meaningful work, connection to nature, freedom from the chronic stress of modern life. They're not primitive or simple. They're sophisticated people with complex cultures living in ways that work for their environments. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago probably felt the same way about their lives that you feel about yours. Some days were good, some days were hard, some people were happy, some struggled. Children laughed and played, adults worried and planned and argued and loved. The specific concerns were different, worrying about whether the rains would come rather than whether the mortgage would be paid. But the emotional landscape was probably similar, because they were human, fully, completely human, with the same capacity for joy and sorrow, hope and fear, love and anger, living in circumstances wildly different from ours, but experiencing life with the same depth and complexity. They weren't primitive predecessors, waiting to evolve into something better. They were the genuine article, sophisticated people adapted to their world, successful in ways we can barely imagine. And their success in this hunter-gatherer lifestyle would continue for tens of thousands more years. This wasn't a temporary phase, a stepping stone to something else. This was the human condition, the way our species was designed by evolution to live. Agriculture wouldn't be invented for another 90,000 years. Cities wouldn't exist for 95,000 years. For almost all of the time between them and us, humans would live this way. Hunting, gathering, moving with the seasons, dependent on wild resources and detailed ecological knowledge. 100,000 years ago, this lifestyle was working. Populations were small but stable. Technologies were sophisticated enough for survival. Social systems were functional. Cultural knowledge was accumulating. The pieces were in place for humans to eventually colonize the planet. But that was still far in the future. Right now, surviving to tomorrow was achievement enough. Picture a cave mouth on the southern coast of Africa. It's nightfall 100,000 years ago. The sun has set over the ocean and darkness is coming fast. Inside the cave entrance, protected from wind, someone is carefully arranging wood. Not randomly, but with purpose. Tinder first, dry grass and fine bark. Small twigs next, arranged to allow airflow. Larger sticks on top, positioned to catch once the smaller materials are burning. Someone else approaches with a coal from an existing fire, kept burning through the day, fed carefully, never allowed to go completely out. The coal touches the tinder, gentle blowing, just enough to provide oxygen without scattering the ember, a wisp of smoke, then a tiny flame, more blowing carefully, patiently. The flame grows, catches the twigs, spreads. Within minutes, fire. This moment, repeated thousands of times in thousands of locations, represents one of humanity's most important relationships. Not with another person, but with a force of nature, fire, the thing that kept the darkness away, that transformed raw food into cooked meals, that extended the habitable zone far beyond where naked apes had any right to survive. 100,000 years ago, humans had been using fire for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe 1 million years, depending on how you interpret the evidence. But there's a difference between using fire opportunistically, taking advantage of natural fires started by lightning, and actually controlling it, making it, maintaining it, understanding it well enough to keep it going reliably. By 100,000 years ago, that control was sophisticated. Humans knew how to start fires, probably through multiple methods. Friction, spinning a hardwood stick against a softer base, creating enough heat to ignite tinder. Percussion, striking certain types of stone against iron pyrite to create sparks. These techniques require knowledge, skill, practice. They're not obvious or easy to discover, but once discovered and passed down, they give humans independence from waiting for lightning strikes. More importantly, humans knew how to maintain fire. This is arguably more valuable than starting it. Starting a fire from scratch takes time and effort and favourable conditions, but if you can keep a fire going indefinitely, you only need to start it once, feeding it with appropriate fuel throughout the day, banking it at night, covering it with ash to slow combustion, keeping coals alive until morning when you can rebuild it, transporting coals when moving camp, carrying them carefully in bark containers or clay vessels, ensuring the fire travels with you. Fire management became a skill passed down through generations. Children learned which woods burned hot and which burned long, which materials created the most smoke, useful for smoking meat or driving insects away, which materials were best for specific purposes. Hard woods for long burning cooking fires, resinous woods for bright flames, providing light. Green wood for creating smoke signals. This was chemistry and physics understood practically, through experience rather than theory. The benefits of fire were enormous. Start with cooking. Raw food is harder to digest, requires more chewing, provides fewer available calories. Cooking breaks down plant cell walls and denatures proteins, making nutrients more accessible. Meat becomes tender and safe, bacteria killed by heat. Tough plant materials become edible. Toxic compounds in some plants are destroyed by cooking, expanding the range of edible species. This matters more than you might think. The human digestive system is relatively small and inefficient compared to other primates. We can't extract as much nutrition from raw plant materials as gorillas can. But we don't need to, because we cook our food. This allows us to maintain large, energy-hungry brains on a diet that wouldn't support an equivalent ape. Some researchers think controlled use of fire and cooking was prerequisite for human brain evolution, that our big brains only became possible once we started cooking. Fire also provided warmth, crucial as climates cooled during the descent into the Ice Age. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago weren't living in the coldest parts of the Ice Age yet, but temperatures were dropping. Nights could be chilly even in Africa. Fire meant humans could remain comfortable in temperatures that would otherwise stress them. This expanded the habitable range, allowed occupation of higher altitudes and more temperate zones. Protection was another benefit. Large predators don't like fire. Lions, leopards, hyenas, all the things that might view humans as prey, they avoid flames. A fire at the cave entrance or around a camp created a safe zone where humans could sleep without constant vigilance. This is enormous for mental health and quality of life. being able to relax, actually relax, without fear of being eaten in your sleep. Light from fire extended the useful day. Without fire, humans are limited to daylight hours for most activities. You can't make detailed stone tools in the dark, can't process food efficiently, can't have extended social interactions. But fire creates a circle of light, artificial extension of day into night. This extra time could be used productively, but more importantly, it created space for social life. Evening around the fire probably became the main time for social interaction, for storytelling, for teaching, for bonding. The fire itself creates a focus point, draws people together, creates intimacy. Everyone's faces lit by the same flickering light. Voices carrying in the darkness beyond. This is where culture gets transmitted, where children learn from elders, where group identity gets reinforced. Modern studies of hunter-gatherers show that conversation around evening fires is when most oral tradition gets passed on. Stories about ancestors, about the land, about proper behavior. Explanations of natural phenomena, moral lessons embedded in narratives, information about resource locations and seasonal patterns. All of this flowing through conversation, memorable because it's embedded in stories, retained because it's shared socially. 100,000 years ago, around fires in African caves and rock shelters, something similar was probably happening. Languages we'll never know, speaking words we'll never hear, but the content likely similar. How to find water during droughts, where the antelope herds migrate, how to recognize edible plants, stories about past hunts, past challenges, past triumphs, gradually building up a body of cultural knowledge that let groups survive. Fire also enabled technologies that wouldn't work otherwise. Heat treatment of stone, which we mentioned earlier, requires controlled fire hot enough and long enough to alter the internal structure of certain rocks. Hardening wooden spear points, briefly exposing them to flame to drive out moisture and create a harder, more durable point. Processing hide, using smoke to preserve leather and make it more workable. In some regions, fire was used for landscape management, deliberately setting fires to clear underbrush, promote growth of desired plants, drive game animals, improve hunting grounds. This is sophisticated environmental manipulation, using fire as a tool to reshape ecosystems to human advantage. Whether this was happening 100,000 years ago in Africa is debated, but it's possible. The cognitive ability and technical knowledge required were present. Fire had to be respected. It was useful but dangerous. Get too close and you burn. Let it spread uncontrolled and it destroys everything. Managing fire required constant attention, constant caution. Children had to be taught from a young age to respect it, to not touch it, to understand its dangers along with its benefits. And fire required fuel. In forested areas, no problem, wood everywhere. But in more open environments, finding enough fuel to maintain fires continuously could be challenging. Dead wood had to be gathered, stored, used efficiently. Groups camping in the same location for extended periods might exhaust nearby fuel supplies, forcing moves to new locations. Fire needs shaped settlement patterns and mobility decisions. The archaeological evidence for fire 100,000 years ago comes from several sources. Hearths, circular arrangements of stones with ash and charcoal inside, clearly intentional fire pits. Burned bones, not from natural fires but showing patterns consistent with cooking. Burned sediments in cave deposits, layers of ash from repeated fires, charred plant remains, all of it pointing to systematic controlled use of fire. At some sites, hearths appear in the same location across multiple occupation layers, people returning to the same cave, making their fires in the same spot time after time. This suggests not just use of fire, but planning about where to place it, understanding smoke flow, heat radiation, optimal positioning for cooking and warmth and light. But here's the mystery. Despite evidence of fire use going back hundreds of thousands of years, evidence for fire making is much more recent. We have good evidence for methods of starting fire only from around 50,000 years ago or later. This doesn't mean fire making wasn't happening earlier. It just means the evidence doesn't preserve well. Friction tools are wooden, they rot. Fire starting kits don't preserve like stone tools do. So we're left with inference. By 100,000 years ago, fire use was too systematic, too controlled, too widespread to be based on opportunistic collection of natural fires. Groups must have been able to make fire on demand. The methods might have been the same ones used later, friction and percussion, or they might have been different techniques lost to time, but the capability was there. This control of fire represents a profound shift in the human relationship with the natural world. Other species react to fire with fear, fleeing from it instinctively. Humans alone approached it, studied it, understood it, mastered it, made it serve human purposes. This required overcoming deep instinctive fears, required observational learning and experimentation, and probably painful trial and error. But once achieved, fire control changed what it meant to be human. It extended human capabilities beyond biological limitations, made humans more effective predators, more efficient at processing food, more resistant to environmental extremes. It created social spaces that strengthened group bonds and enabled cultural transmission. It was in every sense a transformative technology. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago understood fire intimately. They knew its moods, its needs, its uses. They fed it and tended it and respected it. They gathered around it in the evening and felt its warmth pushing back the darkness. They saw in its flames the boundary between the human world and the wild world beyond, a circle of safety and society maintained against the vast indifference of nature. Fire was companion, tool, protector. It illuminated their nights and cooked their food and kept predators at bay. It enabled conversations that lasted into darkness, strengthened bonds between individuals, transmitted knowledge across generations. It was technology and culture combined, practical benefit and symbolic power together. And it was universal. Everywhere humans lived, they used fire. Every group controlled it, maintained it, understood it. This wasn't specialized knowledge held by a few. This was fundamental human knowledge, as basic as language, as essential as tool-making. Everyone learned fire management from childhood. Everyone participated in gathering fuel, maintaining hearths, understanding fire behavior. The fires that burned in African caves 100,000 years ago are long extinguished. The people who built and tended them are gone, dust in the archaeological record. But the knowledge they developed, the relationship with fire they established, that continued, passed down generation after generation, refined and elaborated, but fundamentally unchanged. Your ancestors 10,000 years ago used fire the same ways your ancestors 100,000 years ago did. Because fire, once mastered, became part of what humans were. Not an optional technology, but a defining characteristic. The species that makes fire, that lives by fire, that shapes the world with fire. 100,000 years ago, that relationship was fully established. The flames in those ancient caves were burning bright, pushing back the darkness, making humans a little less vulnerable in a dangerous world. And they would keep burning. Here's something that might surprise you. Your brain isn't actually very good at a lot of things. You can't run as fast as a cheetah, can't see as well as an eagle, can't hear ultrasonic frequencies like a bat, or navigate by magnetic fields like a sea turtle. What your brain is exceptionally good at, what it's been optimized for through millions of years of evolution, is dealing with other human brains. This is called the social brain hypothesis, the idea that human intelligence evolved primarily for navigating complex social relationships, rather than for solving technical problems or understanding the physical world. And 100,000 years ago, this social intelligence was operating at full capacity. Your ancestors were social specialists, experts at reading each other, cooperating, competing, forming alliances, managing relationships within their small groups. Think about what it takes to live in a group of 20 to 50 people, where everyone knows everyone else, where you're related to most people by blood or marriage, where you'll probably spend your entire life with the same individuals. You need to track relationships, who's allied with whom, who owes whom favors, who's trustworthy and who's not, who's a good hunter, who's a skilled gatherer, who knows the most about plant medicines or tool-making or territory. You need to communicate effectively, not just exchange basic information, but understand nuance, read between the lines, detect when someone isn't being entirely honest. Human communication is incredibly sophisticated, operating on multiple levels simultaneously. The literal content of words, the tone and body language, the context and shared history, the unspoken assumptions and implications. You need to cooperate on tasks that require coordination. Hunting large game requires multiple people working together, timing their actions, trusting each other not to panic or make mistakes that endanger everyone. Building shelters, processing large amounts of food, defending against predators or hostile groups, all of this requires cooperation that goes beyond simple instinct. But you also need to compete for status, for mates, for resources within the group. This competition has to be managed carefully because the group is small enough that serious conflict could destroy it. So humans evolved sophisticated ways of competing without destroying social bonds, using reputation and social influence rather than direct violence, building coalitions and alliances, engaging in competition that's intense but rarely lethal. 100,000 years ago, all of this social complexity was humming along in groups scattered across Africa. People were gossiping, sharing information about each other's behaviour. They were forming friendships, deeper bonds with certain individuals. They were teaching children not just technical skills, but social skills, how to read people, how to behave appropriately, how to navigate the complex web of relationships. Group size matters here. Anthropologists have observed that there's a natural limit to how large human groups can be while maintaining tight social bonds. This limit, called Dunbar's number, is around 150 people. That's how many individuals you can maintain stable relationships with, know personally, track their relationships with others. Beyond that, groups need hierarchies and formal structures to function. But 100,000 years ago, groups were much smaller than Dunbar's number. 20 to 50 people is a size where everyone can know everyone else intimately, where direct democracy is possible, where decisions can be made by consensus, where formal leadership isn't necessary. This creates a different kind of social dynamic than larger groups. In such small groups, reputation becomes crucial. You can't escape your reputation because everyone knows everything about you. If you're generous and skilled and reliable, everyone knows it. If you're selfish or lazy or dishonest, everyone knows that too. And because you'll be living with these same people for your entire life, maintaining a good reputation matters enormously. This creates strong incentives for prosocial behavior, sharing food even when you're hungry, helping others even when it costs you time and energy, being honest and keeping promises, because the long-term benefit of having a good reputation outweighs the short-term advantage of acting selfishly. This is reciprocal altruism at work, encoded not in genes but in social dynamics. Sharing was particularly important. Hunting success is variable. Some days you kill a large animal, more meat than you could possibly eat before it spoils. Other days you come back empty-handed. If everyone hoards their own kills, people starve when they're unlucky. But if successful hunters share, everyone eats more regularly. And because everyone's fortunes vary, sharing creates a natural insurance system. This isn't pure altruism, it's enlightened self-interest. You share today because you'll need others to share with you tomorrow, but enforcing this sharing requires social mechanisms, norms about appropriate behaviour, social pressure on those who try to hoard, praise and status for generous individuals, gossip and criticism for selfish ones. All of this operating through social channels rather than formal rules. Gift-giving probably played a role too, not giving food immediately needed for survival, but gifts of shell beads, decorated objects, specially made tools. These gifts create obligations, establish relationships, signal status and intention. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers see elaborate gift exchanges that cement alliances and smooth over conflicts. Similar dynamics probably operated 100,000 years ago. Kinship structured much of social life. Who you were related to determined many of your relationships and obligations. Parents and children, obviously, but also siblings, cousins, aunts and uncles, grandparents if they survive to old age. In small groups where everyone's related, kinship creates a network of mutual obligation and support. But kinship wasn't the only bond. Friendship existed too. Personal preferences that led some people to spend more time together, trust each other more, support each other beyond what kinship required. And these friendships could be strategic, alliances formed between individuals who could help each other in various ways. Marriage created bonds between families. In groups this small, everyone's related to everyone else within a few generations, so marriages probably often involved individuals from different groups. This created connections between groups, opportunities for visits and trade and information exchange. It also meant that conflicts between groups had to be managed carefully, because people had relatives on both sides. Children weren't just raised by their parents. In groups this size, all adults participated in childcare to some degree. Children played together under the casual supervision of whoever was nearby. They learned from any adult willing to teach. This distributed childcare meant children were exposed to multiple teaching styles and bodies of knowledge, gave them relationships with many adults, integrated them into the full group from early age. Older children helped care for younger ones. This is seen in all traditional societies. A 6-year-old watching a 3-year-old, teaching them, playing with them, keeping them from danger. This helped parents by reducing childcare burden, but also taught older children responsibility and gave them practice for when they'd have children of their own. Elders, if they survived long enough, became repositories of knowledge. They'd seen droughts and good years, successful hunts and failures, conflicts and resolutions. Their memories stretched back decades, providing historical perspective that younger adults lacked. In societies without writing, where all knowledge exists in human memory, having elderly individuals who remember the past is crucial for continuity. Status existed but wasn't formalized. The best hunter might have high status, the most knowledgeable gatherer, the person best at resolving disputes or organizing group activities, but this status was earned through demonstrated ability and could be lost if someone else proved more capable. It didn't confer permanent authority. Even high-status individuals had to operate through persuasion and consensus rather than command. Gender relationships are hard to reconstruct from archaeological evidence. Modern hunter-gatherers show considerable variation, from relatively egalitarian to more male-dominated. Probably 100,000 years ago showed similar variation. But generally, both genders contributed substantially to food acquisition, and both had important roles in group decision-making. The strict gender hierarchies seen in some agricultural societies probably didn't exist. Conflict within groups had to be managed carefully. Arguments happened, personalities clashed, competitions for status and mates created tensions. But with groups so small, letting conflicts escalate to serious violence would be catastrophic. So humans evolved sophisticated conflict resolution mechanisms, mediation by respected individuals, social pressure to reconcile, customs and norms that channeled competition into non-lethal forms. Physical violence within the group probably happened, but was rare and strongly sanctioned. Serious injury or death of a group member weakened the whole group, made everyone less safe. Groups couldn't afford to lose members to internal violence, so cultures probably had strong norms against it, and individuals who couldn't control violent impulses might be expelled or killed if they posed too much danger. Violence between groups is harder to assess. Competition over territories and resources certainly existed. Encounters with other groups might be tense, potentially dangerous. But whether 100,000 years ago saw organized warfare or just occasional violent confrontations is unclear. Groups were small enough that losing multiple members in fighting would be devastating. This creates incentives to avoid violence when possible, to resolve disputes through negotiation, or simply avoiding each other. Trade and exchange probably happened when groups encountered each other. Exchange of tools, raw materials, ornaments, exchange of information about resources and dangers. Maybe exchange of marriage partners, though this is speculation. These interactions would have been opportunities for cultural transmission, for technologies and ideas to spread between groups. Language made all of this possible. You can't maintain complex social relationships without sophisticated communication. You can't teach effectively, can't gossip, can't plan cooperatively, can't resolve conflicts through discussion without language. And 100,000 years ago, language was almost certainly fully modern, capable of expressing complex abstract concepts and subtle social information. The archaeological evidence doesn't tell us directly about social structures. Stone tools and shell beads don't reveal who was friends with whom or how conflicts were resolved. But we can infer from what we know about human cognition, from studies of modern hunter-gatherers, from the logic of small group living, and all of it points to rich, complex social lives full of relationships and obligations and opportunities. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago were intensely social creatures. They lived in groups, depended on groups, spent most of their waking hours with other people. Solitude was rare and probably uncomfortable. The group was everything. Source of food through shared labour, source of protection against dangers, source of information and knowledge, source of companionship and meaning, and the group was maintained through Constant social work. Talking, sharing, helping, teaching, playing, arguing, reconciling. Creating and maintaining relationships that made survival possible. Building the social fabric that held the group together through challenges and hardships. This social intelligence, this ability to navigate complex relationships and cooperate effectively, was as important as any technology. Maybe more important, because technologies can be lost and rediscovered. But if the social bonds fail, if the group fragments, everyone's survival is threatened. Maintaining the group, maintaining cooperation, that was the ultimate survival skill. And it required big brains capable of tracking dozens of different relationships simultaneously, understanding others' perspectives and motivations, predicting behavior, deceiving when necessary but also detecting deception, cooperating genuinely while also competing strategically. All of this operating in real time, in thousands of social interactions that shaped daily life. 100,000 years ago, the social brain was fully online. Humans were cooperating at levels no other species could match, building relationships that transcended immediate family, creating obligations that extended across time, accumulating social capital that could be drawn on in times of need, managing conflicts without destroying the group, teaching children how to be social beings as much as how to hunt and gather. This was the foundation, not just of survival, but of everything that would come later. Because human success isn't really about intelligence in the abstract. It's about social intelligence, the ability to work together, share information, build on each other's innovations. 100,000 years ago, that ability was being refined in small groups across Africa. And it would eventually enable humans to spread across the planet and reshape it entirely. Let's talk about what your ancestors actually looked like 100,000 years ago. Because while they were anatomically modern humans, recognizable as our species, there were subtle differences that tell us something about how they lived and what they were adapted for. The problem is we don't have many complete skeletons from this period. Fossilization is rare, and complete preservation even rarer. What we have are fragments. A skull here, some limb bones there, occasional teeth. From these fragments, physical anthropologists try to reconstruct entire bodies, compare them to earlier humans and to modern populations, figure out what changed and why. But the picture that emerges is clear enough. 100,000 years ago, humans had bodies built for endurance, for walking long distances, for surviving in hot climates, for a lifestyle that was physically demanding but not requiring extreme strength or speed in any particular burst. Start with height. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago were roughly modern in stature, though there was considerable variation between populations just as there is today. Men averaged perhaps 5 feet 6 to 5 feet 8, women several inches shorter. Not dramatically different from modern populations, though interestingly, some evidence suggests humans may have actually been slightly taller on average than they are today. This seems counterintuitive. Better nutrition today should make us taller, right? But hunter-gatherers often have quite good nutrition when resources are adequate. Diverse diets, plenty of protein, lots of physical activity promoting bone and muscle development. It wasn't until agriculture that average human height decreased, probably due to less diverse diets and higher disease loads in settled communities. Body proportions are more interesting than overall height. Humans 100,000 years ago, at least those living in Africa, had relatively linear body plans. Long legs relative to torso length, long forearms and lower legs. This is classic adaptation to hot climates. Linear proportions maximize surface area relative to body mass, helping dissipate heat. The same reason desert animals tend to have long legs and ears. Compare this to Neanderthals, who were living in colder climates in Europe and the Middle East at the same time. Neanderthals had shorter, stockier builds, shorter limbs relative to torso. This reduces surface area relative to mass, conserves heat. It's the same pattern you see in Arctic animals versus tropical ones. Humans and Neanderthals were adapting to very different thermal environments. Skull shape is diagnostic for anatomically modern humans. High, rounded brain case, flat, vertical forehead, small brow ridges, prominent chin. These features distinguish modern humans from earlier species like Homo heidelbergensis, or contemporary species like Neanderthals who had heavy brow ridges, sloping foreheads, no chins. Looking at a skull, you can immediately tell if it's anatomically modern or something else. But even within anatomically modern humans, there's variation. Some of the earliest modern human skulls show slightly more robust features than later populations. Thicker skull bones, slightly larger brow ridges, though still small compared to earlier species. This robusticity decreased over time, probably reflecting changes in diet, and perhaps changes in behavior reducing the need for robust skulls. Brain size 100,000 years ago was essentially modern. The cranial capacity, the volume of the skull that holds the brain, averaged around 1,300 cubic centimeters. This is within the normal range for modern humans, actually slightly larger than the current global average. Brain size has actually decreased slightly over the last 20,000 years, probably reflecting decreasing robusticity overall rather than any decline in cognitive ability. What's interesting about brain size is that it had reached modern levels hundreds of thousands of years before modern behavior fully emerged. The hardware was in place long before the software was fully developed. This suggests brain size alone doesn't determine behavioral modernity. Organization matters, neural connections matter. But the sheer size, the raw computational power that was present 100,000 years ago. Teeth tell their own story. Human teeth 100,000 years ago were slightly larger than modern averages, particularly molars. Larger teeth suggest a diet requiring more chewing, perhaps including tougher plant materials. As cooking became more sophisticated and diets changed, teeth size decreased. By 10,000 years ago, with agriculture bringing softer, processed foods, teeth were noticeably smaller. But 100,000 years ago, they were still robust. Jaws were similarly robust. Stronger, heavier jaw bones capable of generating more chewing force. This isn't dramatic. You could still recognize these jaws as human, but the overall trend over the last 100,000 years has been toward lighter, more graceful jaws, as dietary changes reduced the need for powerful chewing. Hand anatomy was fully modern. The precision grip, ability to hold objects between thumb and fingers with fine control had evolved millions of years earlier. But 100,000 years ago, hands showed clear evidence of heavy use. Muscle attachment points on bones were pronounced, indicating strong hand muscles. Finger bones often showed stress markers from repetitive gripping and manipulation. This makes sense given the stone tool technologies we discussed. Knapping stone, creating tools through percussion, requires powerful grip strength and hours of repetitive motion. The hands of accomplished toolmakers 100,000 years ago would have been heavily muscled, calloused, capable of gripping and manipulating stone with a control modern humans rarely develop. Feet were built for walking. The human foot is unique among primates, an arched structure that acts like a spring, storing and releasing energy with each step. This makes human walking incredibly efficient. We can cover enormous distances without exhausting ourselves, something our ape relatives cannot match. 100,000 years ago, feet showed this same architecture, evidence of a species that walked constantly. Some skeletal markers suggest high activity levels. Bones respond to stress by becoming denser and developing pronounced muscle attachment points. The bones of people 100,000 years ago show these markers strongly. These were active people, using their bodies constantly, developing musculature and bone density that most modern humans never achieve. But they weren't necessarily stronger than modern humans in raw power. The difference is in endurance. Their bodies were adapted for sustained activity over long periods, walking all day, carrying loads for miles, sustained work processing food or making tools. This kind of activity doesn't produce the explosive strength of modern athletes, but produces remarkable stamina. Sexual dimorphism. The physical differences between males and females was present but not extreme. Men were larger on average, with more robust skeletons and greater muscle mass. Women were smaller, with wider hips for childbirth, but the difference was less than in earlier human species and less than in some modern apes. This relatively low sexual dimorphism might reflect social structures where male-male competition wasn't as intense, where cooperation mattered more than individual physical dominance. Skin color is impossible to determine from fossils, but we can make educated guesses based on genetics and adaptation. Humans living in Africa 100,000 years ago almost certainly had dark skin, rich in melanin, providing protection against intense UV radiation. Light skin would have been disadvantageous at equatorial latitudes, leading to skin cancer and folate destruction. Body hair had largely disappeared except on the head and in patches. We discussed this in detail in the earlier script about hair loss, but it bears repeating here. Relative hairlessness, combined with abundant eccrine sweat glands, was a key adaptation, allowing effective cooling during sustained activity in hot climates. The bodies of your ancestors 100,000 years ago were essentially naked, covered in skin rather than fur. Vision was acute. Human eyes are good at detecting detail, seeing colour, tracking movement. The fossil evidence suggests modern visual capabilities were present. Hearing was within modern ranges. Smell was probably better than in most modern humans, since the lifestyle would have emphasized paying attention to environmental odors. Overall health is harder to assess. We can see some diseases in bones, arthritis, healed fractures, infections that affected bone tissue. What we see suggests people often had injuries, lived with pain, dealt with health problems. But they also frequently healed from injuries that would have been fatal without group support. Broken limbs that healed, showing the individual survived long after the injury. This implies care for the injured, social support, group members keeping someone alive while they recovered. Life expectancy was probably 30 to 40 years on average, though this is heavily weighted by high infant mortality. If you survived childhood and early adulthood, you might live to 50 or 60. Some individuals probably reached their 70s, becoming tribal elders, repositories of decades of accumulated knowledge. Physical appearance would have varied between populations just as it does today. Different African populations show considerable genetic and physical diversity. People living in different regions, adapting to different local environments, would have developed regional characteristics. But they were all recognizably the same species, all capable of interbreeding if they encountered each other. In terms of pure physical capability, your ancestors 100,000 years ago could do things most modern humans cannot. They could walk 30 miles in a day carrying significant weight. They could track animals for hours, maintaining pursuit until the prey exhausted. They could work stone with hands strong enough to fracture rocks reliably. They could identify hundreds of plant species by sight and smell and taste. But they couldn't do things we can. They probably couldn't read fine print since that visual capability wasn't needed and might not have been maintained. They couldn't sit still for 8 hours at a desk. Their bodies weren't adapted for that kind of sustained inactivity. They probably couldn't eat modern processed foods without digestive issues. Their gut flora and digestive systems adapted to completely different diets. The key point is this. The bodies your ancestors had 100,000 years ago were not primitive or inferior versions of modern human bodies. They were sophisticated machines, beautifully adapted for their specific lifestyle and environment, different from modern bodies in some ways, but not worse, in many ways better suited for the lives they lived. If you could somehow transport a baby from 100,000 years ago to the present, raise them in modern society, they'd be indistinguishable from any other modern human. Same physical capabilities, same potential, same range of abilities. The genetic differences are minimal. Essentially all the human genetic diversity that exists today was present 100,000 years ago, at least in Africa where all these populations lived. What's changed isn't the hardware, it's the environment and the culture. Modern humans have softer lives in many ways, less physical demands, different selective pressures. We've lost some capabilities our ancestors had while developing others they lacked. But the underlying biology, the basic human body plan, that was already in place. 100,000 years ago, humans had bodies built for endurance, for efficiency, for surviving in hot African environments through constant activity. They were lean, strong, tireless. They could outwalk any other primate, outrun most animals over distance, maintain activity levels that would exhaust modern sedentary people within hours. And they used these bodies well, walking between camps, hunting game, gathering plants, processing food, making tools, caring for children, all the physical work that survival required. Their bodies were tools as much as their stone implements were, honed by evolution and individual activity into instruments capable of remarkable feats. If you could see them walking across the landscape, you'd recognize them as human. The way they moved, the way they carried themselves, the expressions on their faces, all of it familiar. Because these weren't alien creatures, they were us. Same species, same basic biology, same fundamental humanity, just living in a different world, using their bodies in ways we rarely do anymore. 100,000 years ago, the world had multiple human species walking around. Not just Homo sapiens, but Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans somewhere in Eastern Asia, possibly Homo erectus still hanging on in parts of Indonesia, maybe other species we haven't discovered yet. Earth was populated by different kinds of humans, each adapted to their particular environments, each with their own evolutionary history. And some of them were starting to meet each other. Because 100,000 years ago, a few groups of Homo sapiens were attempting something that hadn't been done successfully before. They were trying to leave Africa, to push out into new territories, to expand the range of the species beyond its evolutionary homeland. The evidence for these early exits is fragmentary but fascinating. Fossil sites in Israel, caves at Skul and Kafza, contain anatomically modern human remains dated to around 100,000 years ago, maybe slightly older. These weren't just visits. People were living there, making tools, burying their dead in ways that suggest symbolic behaviour. They'd made it out of Africa, crossed the Sinai Peninsula, established themselves in the Levant. But here's what's puzzling. These populations apparently didn't persist. Later, we find Neanderthals occupying the same caves. The modern humans who'd been there either died out or retreated back to Africa. This early attempt at colonising new territories failed. The reasons aren't clear, but climate was probably involved. Remember, 100,000 years ago the world was cooling, sliding toward the depths of the last ice age. Climate in the Middle East was becoming more variable, more challenging. Resources that had been reliable became scarce. Water sources dried up. The grasslands that connected Africa to Asia through the Levant contracted during dry periods, becoming barriers rather than corridors. Groups of humans who'd ventured out during favourable periods found themselves trapped when conditions deteriorated, too far from Africa to retreat, unable to sustain populations in increasingly harsh environments. Eventually they disappeared, either dying out entirely or being absorbed by Neanderthals, who were better adapted to the cooling climate. But the attempt itself is significant. It shows that 100,000 years ago humans had the capability to move into new environments, to survive at least temporarily outside Africa. The cognitive and technological toolkit was sufficient. What wasn't sufficient yet was either population size, allowing enough people to maintain viable groups, or perhaps specific adaptations needed for colder climates. These early encounters with Neanderthals raise fascinating questions. What happened when modern humans and Neanderthals met? Were the interactions hostile, competitive? Did they avoid each other? Did they communicate despite likely language differences? Did they trade? The archaeological record is silent on these details. We know the groups existed in the same regions during overlapping time periods, but we can't reconstruct the nature of their interactions. Later evidence from tens of thousands of years after this period shows that modern humans and Neanderthals did occasionally interbreed. Modern non-African populations carry small amounts of Neanderthal DNA, around 1 to 2% of their genomes. This indicates that when the groups met, they didn't always treat each other as enemies or separate species. Sometimes they produced offspring together. Whether this interbreeding was happening 100,000 years ago is uncertain. The genetic evidence is complicated, and the populations that contributed most of the Neanderthal ancestry in modern humans might have been later groups. But it's possible that these early modern humans in the Levant occasionally interbred with Neanderthals they encountered. What's clear is that the world 100,000 years ago was more diverse than it is today. Neanderthals weren't primitive precursors to modern humans. They were sophisticated people with their own technological traditions, their own cultural practices. They controlled fire, made complex tools, buried their dead, cared for injured group members. They survived in Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, clearly well adapted to their environments. Denisovans, known primarily from genetic evidence, and a handful of fragmentary fossils were living somewhere in Asia. We don't know exactly where or in what habitats. We don't know what they looked like beyond a few teeth and bone fragments. But genetic analysis shows they were a distinct lineage, related to Neanderthals but separate. And like Neanderthals, they apparently occasionally interbred with modern humans, contributing DNA that persists in some modern populations, particularly in Southeast Asia and Oceania. The fact that multiple human species existed simultaneously matters for understanding 100,000 years ago. Modern humans weren't unique in their capabilities. They weren't dramatically more intelligent or more sophisticated than Neanderthals or Denisovans. All these species had large brains, complex tools, controlled fire, lived in social groups. What modern humans may have had was slight advantages in certain areas. Perhaps better communication through more developed language. Perhaps more flexible behavior, better at innovating and adapting to new situations. Perhaps larger social networks, ability to maintain alliances across greater distances. These small advantages wouldn't be obvious in any single encounter, but over thousands of years they might accumulate. The other human species would eventually go extinct. Neanderthals disappeared around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans vanished at roughly the same time. Homo erectus, if any population still existed, were gone by 50,000 years ago. By 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was the only human species left on Earth. Whether this was due to competition, interbreeding, climate change, or some combination remains debated. But 100,000 years ago, that outcome wasn't inevitable. There was no guarantee that Homo sapiens would be the survivor. If anything, Neanderthals seemed better positioned. They'd been successfully living in Ice Age environments for hundreds of thousands of years. They had the adaptations, the knowledge, the technological traditions for cold climate survival. Modern humans were tropical specialists trying to expand their range. The failed early exits from Africa show how difficult this expansion was. It wasn't enough to have modern anatomy and technology. You needed favourable climate windows. You needed enough people to maintain viable populations during difficult periods. You needed either biological adaptations to new environments or cultural innovations that could substitute for biological adaptation. 100,000 years ago, modern humans didn't quite have all these pieces in place. They could make it to the Levant during favourable periods, but they couldn't establish permanent populations. They couldn't push further into Asia or Europe, territories held by Neanderthals and other human species better adapted to those regions. But the attempts continued. Periodically, during favourable climate phases, groups of modern humans would expand out of Africa. Most of these expansions probably failed, populations dying out or retreating. But each attempt was a learning opportunity, a chance to develop technologies and strategies for new environments, a chance to test what worked and what didn't. Some researchers think there were multiple waves of migration out of Africa throughout this period. Small groups moving during climate windows created by orbital cycles that temporarily made the Sahara and Middle East more habitable. Most of these waves failing to establish permanent populations, but gradually accumulating the knowledge and adaptations needed for eventual success. The successful expansion, the one that would eventually populate all of Eurasia and beyond, probably didn't happen until around 60 to 70,000 years ago. That expansion was different. Whether due to population growth in Africa, technological innovations, favourable climate, or some combination, these later migrants succeeded where earlier ones had failed. They not only reached Asia and Europe, but established permanent populations that thrived and expanded. But the groundwork for that success was laid earlier. The attempted exits 100,000 years ago, the brief establishments in the Levant, the encounters with other human species, all of this provided experience and knowledge. Even if individual attempts failed, the learning persisted, passed down through generations, accumulating until the right combination of factors allowed successful expansion. 100,000 years ago represents a threshold, moment. Humans standing at the edge of their evolutionary homeland, looking out at a world full of possibilities and dangers. A world already occupied by other human species who'd left Africa long before and adapted to its challenges. A world that would require new technologies, new strategies, new forms of cooperation to successfully colonize. The threshold hadn't been crossed yet. That would take tens of thousands more years. But the attempts were being made, the experiments were happening, groups were pushing boundaries, testing limits, learning what was possible and what wasn't. And through these attempts, successful or not, humans were developing the capabilities that would eventually allow them to spread across the planet. Your ancestors 100,000 years ago were still primarily African. Most human populations were still living on the continent where the species evolved, but some were venturing out, trying new territories, encountering new environments and new species. They were explorers, pioneers, taking risks that often ended in failure but sometimes in survival. And in those survival stories, those successful establishments, however brief, were the seeds of what would come later. The knowledge gained from living in the Levant even temporarily wouldn't have been completely lost when populations failed. Some individuals would have retreated back to Africa, carrying with them experience of different climates, different prey animals, different challenges. This knowledge could be shared, taught, incorporated into cultural traditions. The same with encounters with Neanderthals and possibly Denisovans. Information about these other humans, their tools, their behaviours, might have been transmitted back to African populations. Interbreeding, if it occurred, would have transferred genes potentially useful in new environments. All of this contributing to the eventual successful expansion. 100,000 years ago was a moment of possibility. A moment when humans had developed enough capability to imagine expansion beyond their homeland but hadn't yet figured out how to make that expansion permanent. A moment when multiple human species coexisted, each with their own territories and adaptations, the eventual outcome still uncertain. From our perspective, knowing how the story ends, it seems inevitable that modern humans would spread across the world and become the dominant species. But 100,000 years ago, that wasn't obvious. The outcome could have been different. Neanderthals might have outcompeted modern humans. Climate changes might have driven humans extinct. The species might have remained confined to Africa. But that's not what happened. The experiments continued, the learning accumulated, and eventually the threshold would be crossed. Not at 100,000 years ago, but later, after more time, more attempts, more innovations. The groundwork laid during this period would pay off, but that payoff was still in the future, still waiting to happen, still uncertain. So here we are, at the end of this journey through 100,000 years ago. And maybe you're wondering why any of this matters. Why spend time thinking about people who lived so long ago, in such different circumstances, facing challenges we'll never experience? What does their world have to do with ours? Everything, actually. Because the humans living 100,000 years ago weren't just random ancestors. They were the foundation. Every human alive today, all 8 billion of us scattered across every continent, living in cities and villages and remote wilderness, all of us descended from those small populations surviving in Africa during that crucial period. The innovations they developed, the behaviours they refined, the knowledge they accumulated, all of it got passed down through 10,000 generations to reach you. That's what culture does. It allows information to flow across time, connecting people separated by enormous spans of years, letting the lessons learned by your ancestors inform your life today. Consider the technologies we discussed. Stone tools, composite construction, heat treatment of materials, pigment processing. These specific technologies are obsolete, obviously. You're not going to make a Levallois core or string shell beads for daily wear. But the principles behind them, the cognitive abilities they represent, those are still operating. When you plan a complex project, visualizing the end result before you begin, working backward to figure out the steps needed to get there, you're using the same abstract thinking that let someone 100,000 years ago prepare a stone core for flaking. When you teach someone a complicated skill, demonstrating, explaining, correcting mistakes, you're using social learning mechanisms refined over hundreds of thousands of years. The symbolic thinking we saw emerging 100,000 years ago, expressed in engraved patterns and shell beads, that's the foundation of everything you take for granted. Language is symbolic thinking. Writing is symbolic thinking. Mathematics, music, art, all of it built on the ability to let one thing represent another thing, to create and share abstract meanings. 100,000 years ago, this ability was just developing, just beginning to express itself in material form. Now it's so fundamental to human life that we barely notice it. You live in a world of symbols, the words you're reading right now, the numbers on your clock, the logos on your clothes, the emojis in your messages, all of it depending on shared symbolic meanings that exist only because humans agreed they exist. The social intelligence we explored, the ability to navigate complex relationships and cooperate in large groups, that's operating in your life constantly. Every conversation you have, every social interaction, every time you cooperate with strangers on a shared task, you're using cognitive abilities shaped by millions of years of social evolution, and refined by the intense social demands faced by groups 100,000 years ago. You can read people's emotions from their faces. You can detect when someone's lying or hiding something. You can understand implied meanings that aren't stated directly. You can maintain friendships with people you don't see often. You can cooperate with strangers based on shared norms and expectations. All of this seems natural, but it's actually extraordinarily sophisticated, the product of evolutionary pressures that made humans into social specialists. The fire control we discussed, that transformed into all modern energy technologies. The principle is the same. Humans learned to harness and control sources of energy external to their own bodies, using that energy to transform materials and expand capabilities. 100,000 years ago it was wood fires for cooking and warmth. Now it's fossil fuels and electricity and nuclear power. But the fundamental concept, using controlled energy to reshape the environment, that traces back to those first intentionally maintained fires. Even the hunter-gatherer lifestyle itself, though abandoned by most humans thousands of years ago, shaped who we are. Our bodies are still adapted for that lifestyle. We're built for endurance, for walking long distances, for varied physical activity. The diseases of modern sedentary life, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, many of these emerge because our bodies expect activity levels our ancestors had, but most modern people don't. Our brains expect certain social environments too. Small groups where everyone knows everyone else. Direct participation in food acquisition. Time spent outdoors in varied natural environments. Work that's physically active and directly purposeful. When modern life doesn't provide these, we often feel the absence. The sense that something's missing. That life should feel different somehow. This isn't nostalgia for a past we never experienced. It's recognition that human nature was shaped by hundreds of thousands of years living in particular ways, and only the last 10,000 years, less than 1% of human history, living in agricultural and industrial societies. The mismatch between what we evolved for and how we actually live creates tensions we're still trying to resolve. But here's what's remarkable. Despite all the changes, despite living in ways our ancestors couldn't have imagined, we're still fundamentally the same species. The humans 100,000 years ago had the same basic emotional range you have. They felt love and grief, joy and anger, fear and hope. They wondered about their world, told stories, laughed at jokes, worried about their children. If you could somehow communicate with them, overcome the language barrier, you'd find minds that worked like yours. Different knowledge, different beliefs, different assumptions about how the world works, but the same underlying cognitive machinery. The same capacity for abstract thought, for planning, for creativity, for empathy. This continuity across time is profound. You're not separate from your ancestors 100,000 years ago. You're them, continued. Every cell in your body built from instructions they carried, every thought you think processed by a brain organized like theirs, every social bond you form using instincts they developed, every symbolic meaning you understand possible, because they learned to think symbolically. And they live on, not just in you, but in everyone. Every human culture, no matter how different on the surface, traces back to those African populations. Every language spoken today descended from whatever languages were being spoken 100,000 years ago. Every technology, no matter how advanced, built on foundations laid then. This is why studying 100,000 years ago matters. Not because it's quaint or exotic or romantically primitive, because it's us. The moment when modern humans were becoming fully modern, when all the pieces that would eventually produce civilization were clicking into place, when the trajectory that would lead from small bands of African hunter-gatherers to global technological society was being established. The choices your ancestors made 100,000 years ago, the innovations they developed, the knowledge they accumulated, the social bonds they maintained, all of it rippled forward through time. Some innovations were kept and refined, others were lost and had to be rediscovered. But the overall direction was clear. Increasing technological sophistication, growing population sizes, expanding geographic range, accumulating cultural complexity. This trajectory wasn't inevitable. It could have gone differently. Humans could have gone extinct during one of the many climate crises, could have remained confined to Africa, could have stayed at 100,000 year ago levels of technology and social organization. Nothing about human evolution guaranteed the outcome we see today. But it happened, and understanding how it started, what 100,000 years ago actually looked like, gives us perspective on where we are now and where we might be going. Because the same cognitive abilities that let your ancestors survive climate changes and develop innovations are still operating. The same social intelligence that allowed cooperation in small groups now operates at scales of millions or billions. We're still adapting, still innovating, still facing challenges and finding ways to overcome them. The timescale is faster now. Change that took thousands of years then happens in decades or years. But the fundamental processes are the same. Humans using our intelligence, our social cooperation, our technological creativity to navigate whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. 100,000 years ago was a moment in the middle of a long story. Not the beginning, that was millions of years earlier when our lineage first diverged from other apes, not the end that's still being written. But a crucial chapter, the moment when everything that would make humans dominant was coming together. When the pieces were in place but the outcome was still uncertain. Your ancestors then were doing their best, surviving day to day, caring for their children, learning from their elders, cooperating with their groups, creating beauty and meaning in whatever small ways they could. Not thinking about the future thousands of years ahead, just living their lives, doing what needed to be done, and somehow that was enough. Their small successes, their innovations, their knowledge, their children who survived to have children of their own, all of it accumulated, all of it built towards something they couldn't have imagined. The world you live in now, the technological civilization, the global population, the things humans have accomplished and created, they made that possible, not through grand plans or conscious decisions about the future, just through living well in their own time, through being clever and social and innovative enough to survive and pass on what they learned, through being human in the fullest sense. So when you look at your own life, your own challenges and choices and small innovations, remember them. Remember that the ordinary work of living well, of learning and creating and cooperating, that accumulates across generations in ways we can't predict. Remember that you're part of a story that stretches back 100,000 years and forward into a future we can't see. Remember that those people, struggling to survive in Africa 100,000 years ago, living lives we can barely reconstruct from scattered artifacts, they were your ancestors, literally, directly, biologically. Their successes made your existence possible. Their knowledge, however different from yours, was real knowledge, hard-won and precious. Their lives, however different from yours, were fully human lives, as complete and meaningful as yours is. And remember that you carry them forward, in your genes, in your brain structure, in your instincts and capacities, in the culture you inherit and modify and pass on, in the technologies you use and improve, in the knowledge you accumulate and share. You are the latest expression of a lineage stretching back through 100,000 years and beyond, all the way to the first humans and the first life on Earth. That's what they were doing 100,000 years ago. Living, surviving, creating, becoming. And through their efforts, through their small victories and accumulated wisdom, making you possible, making all of us possible, making everything that came after possible. Not bad for a species that barely left any fossils.